Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So unexpectedly, the Anbernic RG503 showed up in my mailbox today, and so we're going to do a quick video about it. Usually what happens when I get one of these devices is I spend like a week really testing it and prodding it and figuring out all the things that I can about it. The problem with those videos is they end up being very long, something like 50 minutes, even close to an hour. And so in today's video, I'm going to try to smash a few of those first impressions into this one here. We're going to make a shorter video today, and then, in about a week or so, I'll make a longer video where I really put it through its paces. And so my goal with this video here is to just give you my first impressions. How does it feel out of the box? What do I think about the buttons and the screen and the operating system? Just those little things first. We'll dive into custom firmware and all those other kind of tweaks later on in a different video. And I actually know nothing about this device. I've heard that it has a PS Vita screen and it's supposed to be pretty nice. But for example, I have no idea what this thing is going to cost. And so I actually find that a little bit exciting. Like, we're going to judge this thing just on the merits of the thing itself, not having to put price into context or anything else like that. And so, without any further delay, let's check it out. Okay, first impressions of the box. It's very typically Anbernic, but the menu on this one does seem to be more comprehensive than in previous models. It has all the hotkeys and some stuff about netplay and streaming too. It comes with a USB-C charging cable, as well as a screen protector kit. And this unit came with a 64GB card with games on it. I'm not sure if every model will have this. Okay, moment of truth here, and as you can probably figure out, I got the blue model. Now this is quite a bit more rounded than any other device I've seen from this company, and the sunken screen gives it a bit of a retro vibe. On the back it has some very shallow grips with a very gritty texture. I'm actually a big fan of this. It reminds me of an Xbox controller. The blue color here has a metallic kind of look to it, but it doesn't feel metallic at all. Up top you can see they continue to use the inline shoulder buttons, but these do seem to be a little bit more curved and large than normal. On top of that, the trigger buttons, the L2 and R2, stick out quite a bit more than the shoulder buttons. And the way these are so curved, it's actually pretty easy to press both the shoulder and the trigger buttons when you want. You'll basically use the meat of the center of your finger for the shoulder buttons and then the tips of your fingers for the triggers. And I would say overall that's not that uncomfortable. It's actually pretty good, partially because this device is a little bit smaller than the 552. Now, unfortunately, it is still quite a stretch from the analog stick to the trigger buttons here. And so I think when you're playing, for example, a first-person shooter game via streaming, this may not be a great fit. And it's unfortunate because this device does have 5 GHz Wi-Fi, and this may limit how comfortable the device is while streaming. But yeah, overall, I like these shallow grips here. It does allow you to kind of grab the device a little bit more firmly. And it does make me feel like the D-pad and the face buttons are front and center on this device. In fact, because the front of the device kind of sinks into the screen, it almost feels like the controls are kind of angled towards the screen as well. It really puts the screen into perspective as you're playing it. And so while it kind of looks like an awkward device, this actually is one of the more ergonomic ones I've tested from Anbernic before. So let's talk a little bit about the individual buttons. We'll start with the D-pad. Now, no surprises here. This has a rubber membrane connection and it feels almost identical to the RG552 and even some of the 351 devices. It's both soft and springy. The face buttons feel very similar as well, although they do feel like they stick out a little bit more from the shell from other devices. But they're still pleasant to touch and nice and responsive. The analog sticks are Nintendo Switch style and they also click down for L3 and R3. Now, surprisingly, this is a very lightweight device for its size. And it actually feels a little bit hollow inside too. I would say this is probably the most hollow feeling of all of the Anbernic devices. It's a sharp contrast from the RG552. The shoulder buttons rattle just a little bit, but it's not terrible. And on the left side, we have the power button, and on the right, we have a volume rocker. On the bottom, we have stereo speakers, an internal SD card for the firmware, reset button, function button, and then an external card here for the games. Overall, I think the design of this device is going to be pretty polarizing, but all the same, it's very comfortable to hold. Now let's take a look at that screen. Like I mentioned in the intro, this actually has the original PS Vita OLED display. So this is a 5-inch display at a 16:9 aspect ratio. And the resolution is 960 by 544, so that's double the PSP resolution. And yeah, like I mentioned, it's kind of odd that the screen is sunken in like this. It's just not a very modern look. It definitely feels like something that was designed in the 90s, and much like the Game Force Qi, I'm not against that. I would say it has a little bit of charm to it and does make it look significantly different than the others. Overall, I would say the size, the lightweightedness, as well as just the overall balance is pretty good on this device. Honestly, I have no complaints. Now let's weigh it and compare it against other devices. As you can see here, it's 236 grams. That's pretty light for a 5-inch device. It's actually just a hair heavier than the Powkiddy RGB10 Max 2, and a bit lighter than the original PS Vita, although it is about 16 grams lighter than the 2000 series of the PS Vita. It is lighter than the RG351MP, which has a metal case, but it is quite a bit heavier than the RG351P. But it is about 120 grams lighter than the RG552, and same thing with the AYN Odin. In terms of size comparisons, it is a little bit bigger than the PS Vita models, but it doesn't feel quite as cramped as those devices tend to feel. It's about on par with the RGB10 Max 2 in terms of size, and quite a bit bigger than the 3.5-inch display devices like the 351P or the 351MP. And same goes with the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. And while it's about the same size as the RG552, it feels a lot smaller, probably because it's so light and more rounded. And here's a size comparison against the AYN Odin, which is a little bit bigger than a Switch Lite. And it's just a tiny little bit smaller than the Steam Deck, as you can see here. You know, overall, I like to say that the AYN Odin is not a pocketable device, it's a portable one. And this one is right at that threshold of potentially being pocketable. It's really going to depend on the size of your pockets. With a pair of shorts, sure, you can put it in, it feels like a big phone. But with a pair of jeans, it may not be the same experience. Okay, let's quickly look at the software first. I'm going to add the games card and then boot it up. Now this device is going to ship with a stock Anbernic firmware, but this time around they did do something different. They actually sent pre-release units over to developers so that they could start working on custom firmware ahead of time. Now unfortunately, I've heard there were issues with those pre-release units, and so the custom firmware isn't ready to go at launch, but it's a really great sign that Anbernic is investing in other developers. But I do think it is going to be just a matter of time before Amber Alec and Jealous are available on this device as well. But as you can see, the stock custom firmware that comes with this device is the modified version of Batocera that was also in the RG552. Now this does have an updated build date, so they've probably added some new features to it. For example, I didn't capture it here on film, but the sleep function does work on this stock firmware now. But yeah, all the problems that were there with the stock version of the RG552 are likely going to be in this one as well. All those weird hotkeys and everything else are probably going to need to get fixed. Now I'm not going to dive into specs in this video, I'll leave that for the review, but I do want to note that it only has 1 GB of RAM. And while that's probably going to be enough for classic retro gaming, it is going to limit the amount of ports that you can bring over to this device. So the ports that are going to work on, like say the RG351 devices, they'll work fine on this, but maybe not some of the 552 ports. Either way, I want to test out some games here and get a feel for the screen itself. We'll start with Super Nintendo here, and first thing you're probably going to notice, it's stretched out to 16:9. And so rather than go and change the settings in RetroArch, I recommend going into the Batocera menu here, and then go into Game Settings and make the adjustments here. For example, under Game Ratio, you can change it to Core Provided, and that means that the emulator will choose what the correct aspect ratio is. And just like that, 4:3 games, like on Super Nintendo, now play in 4:3. Now I'm just using the games that came in that second SD card, and as you can see, they're using the 50Hz version, so the PAL version of this game, which is kind of unfortunate. But I gotta say, the colors on the screen look really good. But the scaling is not perfect. As you can see with Mega Man's Life Bar, there are some issues with the pixelation. So to get into the menu, you're gonna press the Function and B button. I'm gonna go into the video settings here. I'm gonna turn on bilinear filtering, and then I'm gonna add the normal 2x filter. This is the same trick I used on the PS Vita in order to get the resolution to scale correctly for Super Nintendo. And as you can see here, now everything looks really nice. The pixels are well scaled, and the color saturation on this is really good. That's the great thing about an OLED display. The blacks are really dark, and the colors are nice and vibrant. I would say in terms of color balance, this is just about perfect. I am getting some white balance issues in my footage, and that's just because my camera doesn't know what to do with a green background and a blue device. But I would say, trust me, that this looks very nice. I do think that the high resolution display on the RG552 looks a little bit better than this one, but this one is a very close second place, and it makes the RG351 devices look terrible by comparison. Overall, I'm very happy with this OLED panel, which is the first in a major retro handheld like this. Now to exit a game, you're going to press the Function and Start button. That'll bring you back to the main menu. Let's look at a couple other games here. I'm not going to get into a ton of game testing, but I do want to show off some other things. Here's another Super Nintendo game, Link to the Past, and as you can see, this one looks really nice too. I know I've said it a few times now, but this is a really nice panel. I'm happy with it. In fact, even some of the older games, like Game Boy Color here, it looks really good too. It's almost like this one is the scrappy little brother to the RG552. For PS1 here, I actually turned it to a 2x resolution here in the RetroArch settings, and it's still running at full speed. So performance-wise, I think that PlayStation 1 is going to be pretty good. The SD card didn't come with Tekken 3 or Bloody Roar 2 to be able to test those high-end games, but as you can see, R4 is working great. And I'll dive into this during the review, but the performance doesn't seem to be stellar. As you can see, even the opening sequence of Ocarina of Time is having stutters and cannot reach 60 frames per second. I would say the performance on this is better than the 351 devices, but maybe slightly worse than the RG552. But of course, a lot of this has to do with the firmware and not necessarily the device. Nintendo 64 is running the parallel core in RetroArch, which is definitely nowhere near as optimized as the standalone versions of Nintendo 64 emulators. And same thing with Dreamcast. This is running Flycast through RetroArch. And there are newer versions of this that can do auto frame skip, or even the retro run versions are going to run better too. And so this is definitely not the definitive reflection of performance on this device, but it does give you a good idea that this thing is not going to be a little miracle of a handheld. A great example is the standalone PSP emulator, which is kind of the same across the board. And this one's running at a 1x resolution, and it's getting about 80-85% speed. And so I would say this is not going to be a powerhouse when it comes to these systems, regardless of the optimizations. If anything, like with the RG351 devices, it's really going to shine with those lower end systems, basically PS1 and below. But there's a lot more to unpack that I'll have to spend the next week kind of testing and figuring out. For example, within the system settings, there's an option for streaming. And so that's something I'll want to try out here, and will definitely become more robust in the next month or two as custom firmware starts to get released. And I was curious to see whether or not this would boot into Android as well, since the chip is capable of that. But when I take out the SD card and try to turn it on, nothing happens. So for now, it doesn't look like Android's working on this device. Now, a few other stray observations. I tested this for about an hour and a half, and it only lost about 9% battery, so I think battery life on this is actually going to be really good. I would predict at least 6 hours of gameplay. And like I mentioned, I do like these shallow grips on the back. I think it makes it actually probably the most ergonomic Anbernic device I've ever used. And it does make the D-pad and face buttons front and center. At least in my first hour of playing, the face buttons do seem to stick out a little bit more than I would like. It's not the end of the world, but it does leave kind of a hollow feeling as you're pushing down on the buttons. I would say it's slightly less pleasant than it is on other Anbernic devices. And then two other short takeaways. I think that the sound on this is actually some of the best I've ever heard on an Anbernic device. It has really nice spatial stereo. And finally, I'm really impressed with this screen. I loved it on the original PS Vita, and I love it here. The colors are rich and vibrant, and those blacks are so dark and deep, it's very nice. Now the device also has HDMI out, which is going to open up another world of possibilities. I'll check that out during my review. And so yeah, that's about it for my first impressions video of the Anbernic RG503. And this was just a short and sweet look at my first couple hours with the device, and overall I'm pretty happy with it. As always, it's probably all going to come down to price. If they price this thing somewhere between $150 and $175, to me that feels like a really good bargain. But if it does get priced higher than that, and Anbernic tends to price things pretty high compared to their competitors, then we might have to have a different conversation about that. Either way, I'll have a full review of this device coming in the next week or so, and I'm actually really looking forward to the next week of testing out this device. It seems to be really promising. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.